So what we'd like to do now is form our scientific panel up at the front. So let's bring the three plenary speakers up, and then I'm going to introduce three additional scientists who are going to join the panel. All right, our first additional scientist is Dr. Kara Lavender-Law. She's a faculty oceanographer and a chief scientist at the Sea Education Association in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Dr. Law is a physical oceanographer and a research professor at SEA, where she examines how ocean physics determine the distributions and dynamic movements of plastics in the ocean. Dr. Jennifer Brandon received her PhD in biological oceanography from Scripps just last year. Her research looked at the spatial and temporal distribution of microplastics in the vast Pacific Ocean. She's currently the Price Postdoctoral Fellow at the Birch Aquarium. And last but not least, Dr. Tracy Mincer. He's a professor at Florida Atlantic University, Harbor Branch. He's a trained chemist and microbiologist who's conducted research in the field of microbial metagenomics, among other things. Currently, his research centers on microbial ecology, particularly on the fate of plastic debris in the marine environment. So let's welcome our panel. So we have one microphone for the public, unfortunately. So if you guys have a question upstairs, I'd like to encourage you to come downstairs and maybe queue up by the doors or so. So Julia's going to be running the microscope. She might have a microscope, the microphone around. So who would like to ask the first question to our esteemed panel? Don't be shy. We have one here in the front, middle front.
I can probably.
Okay, go for it.
This question, I think, is for Jen. You talked about talking to companies at the source to try to eliminate the plastic. And I was just having a conversation with a relative of mine. That he works with container ships that are shipped around the world. And he was talking about how these crates are wrapped in plastic, just wrapped and wrapped and wrapped in plastic. So from a design solution, we were sitting around the dinner table trying to come up with, well, you could use reusable straps. And he said, well, we have to get them to the company, individual crate by crate. So I was wondering if you've ever addressed that question, or engineers are talking about, because shipping is a huge,
right.
I don't know what you call it. It's just a big carbon footprint, and
right.
There's lots of waste in the shipping industry.
So is this the materials inside the container itself? I think usually on a pallet they're wrapped in a lot of film to be able to
Exactly.
then, yeah.
Yeah, it was around the pallet, and he said it was so that the pallets don't break open, because they're stacked so high on the ships, and then moving them around with the cranes and various mechanisms.
So yeah, I have heard of that use, and actually because that is like an industrial use, I mean, certainly I'd love to see an alternative, but I think right now a pretty good portion of that gets recycled, because when we look at sort of the film recycling numbers, they're led by most of that, which they call the wrap, as opposed to, say, plastic bags, which are a challenge. Most people can't put them in their home recycle bin, and you have to actually bring them to a grocery store. So anyway, usually that's low-density polyethylene. It can be recycled because you're at an industrial setting, and even when it gets shipped to a store, oftentimes they'll have a compaction system to be able to have those. So like the stores that also take plastic bags usually are recycling their film wrap from their pallets being shipped as well. Whether or not that seems like a solution, that's sort of what's happening in terms of what's going on with that.
And is it true that a lot of plastics can only be recycled once? So is that true of filament, that once it's recycled, that's it?
So usually, so what you'd have if you made a new item, so you would have to put some virgin in always. So you can't be sort of, even when you say 100% recycled, there's usually a little bit of virgin that's gone in there. And this I know from like a bottle-to-bottle recycle scheme that happens. So, and then depending upon, so I guess no, in that it takes 17 times in that scheme, which is in Norway, for a bottle to be 100% new virgin. So it's like 1/17 virgin gets added. So in a way, no, but yes, in that you have to have some virgin that's added every time. Yeah.
Other questions out in the audience? Just a couple in the back.
Hi, I wondered if each of you, or a couple of you, could talk about the role of microfibers and maybe highlight some research that's still needed or even possible solutions that you think are possible right now.
I can mention something, I guess, and as can Tracy. So we currently have a project looking at scallop populations in the deep waters off of the North Atlantic. And it turns out that fibers are among the types of plastic that we see in these communities. And so they're challenging to work with because they are a lot more work to separate out from the rest of the organism, for example. But I definitely think that it's an area that's overlooked, partly because it's not as easy to work with as some of the other forms of microplastic that you see in the environment. I also think, though, that it's very important for future sort of impact-like studies that are done to incorporate microfibers into their experimental designs, because right now most of what's being used are spheres. And so I think it's an area that needs to be further explored in terms of the research that we're doing right now to better understand the interaction between higher organisms and the fibers themselves.
Right. Just to add a little bit onto that, how microfibers are frequently found in these aggregates in the ocean that form really a foundation of the food web, and these are called marine snow. And you can take a big bottle of seawater and tumble it, and you'll get formation of these aggregates. And these are in the 100-micron range, these little aggregates, and they're highly bioavailable and craved by filter feeding and suspension feeding organisms. Many of these aggregates contain these fibers in very small pieces of plastic, and thus are really highly uptaken by these organisms.
And Jenny, do you have any comments about how commonly microfibers are found in phytoplankton and zooplankton?
Yeah, so I sampled surface water that's obviously like consumed by zooplankton, and then I sampled a type of zooplankton that's a non-selective filter feeder called a salp, and fibers by far dominated all my samples. Fibers were the most common thing in surface water and in the salp stomachs. And of the salps that I dissected, 100% of the salps that I looked at ingested plastic, and most commonly what I was seeing was microfibers. So it is a really big problem. That being said, because we live in such a plastic age, we actually have a relatively big problem of actually scientists contaminating our own samples, because we're wearing plastic and there's plastic in our air, and you have to kind of correct your own samples for that contamination because we live in this plastic world. And so now that we're seeing so much microfiber in our samples, I think we're designing better experiments to correct for that in the future.
Anyone else on the panel want to comment on that?
She asked about solutions, I think, a little bit. So we don't know if this is because of the filters on the washing machines, but some of the samples in South Korea, and I know also in Japan, there's actually filters on washing machines, and they found less microfiber there. I don't know if anyone's done an exact experiment for comparison, but sort of looking at some of that research. So anyway, filters on washing machines, also There's some things you can put in your washing machine, like the Coraball will reduce microfiber some. There's a Guppy bag. I'm not endorsing any of these, but there are products out there. If you care, you can try to, keep fibers from at least going out with your wash water and those that are generated in the washing machine itself.
Great. Kara, did you want to add something?
Oh, I was just going to say that I know at least Patagonia and probably some other clothing manufacturers are carefully looking at this and thinking about ways that they can change their manufacturing to use, for example, longer threads, I think, so that the shedding goes down in the clothing. But I live in Maine, and I'm not going to stop wearing my fleece, so I'm not sure what the real solution is going to be.
Great. We had another question in the back, right?
Yeah, I have a question about economics. So I don't know if there's an expert up there, but so what is the economics of recycling? Is putting recycling, businesses in developing countries, is this even feasible? How much of it's subsidized by state or government here in the US? And yeah, are there NGOs that are like paying people to pick up plastics? For instance, Sub-Saharan Africa, I know there's like heaps and yeah. And then lastly, does picking up trash, I think it's a great thing to do, but like to what extent, what percentage of plastics does doing beach cleanups and all this sort of stuff actually remove from the ocean?
Before I turn this over to the panel, I just wanted to remind everyone that tomorrow night's public event will feature a portfolio of different NGOs, and they'll be here to discuss these very topics. So if you're interested in hearing straight from them, please come back tomorrow. Anyone from the panel want to offer some insight?
I can talk about the economics of recycling a little bit. So to be honest, they're challenging right now in the United States, and that's for various reasons. We have switched over to single stream, which made it really simple for the citizen to say, all my recyclables go into one bin, and my trash goes into another bin, and then engineers like us have designed these facilities to separate out all those materials, mostly mechanically through screening and various systems, but also some manual sorting as well. But we've created commodities that aren't as clean as they need to be. They don't have as high value as if it's source separated up front, where you would put all your different recyclables in different bins. And that's made some challenges, and added to that challenge is the fact that China used to take much of the recycled material that wasn't so clean to be able to do a secondary sort, which they now are no longer doing. So it's kind of really had a high impact on the global economy of recycling, to be honest. And so it is somewhat challenging, but it's not, and the fact is we need an economy of scale with it, so we actually need more recycling to make it more economical to happen, and more use of recycled materials. So we shouldn't stop recycling, but it does need somewhat, I would say, some interventions, and we need to think about designing our products specifically for recycling. Again, that is down the chain from reducing in the first place and others, but if we have to have some packaging, then try to design it in such a way that it can be recycled. And for the informal collectors, they do make money. Many people make their living by picking through trash. Sometimes they do it entrepreneurial, going to people's homes. In some cases, they're just picking through trash that's dumped on the ground or in a trash can, and it does have a value, and it's traded many people. It goes from an independent or an informal collector to a junk shop to a middle person to then sometimes a processor. And there's a whole economic system based upon that around the world.
Great. And on the topic of economics, something, I'm not sure how much work has been done, but has anyone gone on to estimate, the cost of plastic pollution in our oceans or in our seafood supply? Maybe Bryce can comment on, some of the commercial values of some of our global fisheries.
Maybe others on the panel know more than me, but I didn't see any papers that made a comprehensive effort to estimate the economic impact associated with global ocean plastic? I guess in a fisheries context, so one of the last questions the gentleman asked was, does it make a difference to clean up the beach? And I guess the answer to that is it depends. And you have to decide, and this is my fisheries biologist coming out, you have to decide what your derived benefit metric is. Is it just total amount of plastic removed? Or is it the amount of plastic removed that's bioavailable or is likely to have impacts associated with entanglements or ingestion by seabirds? Then the answer might change quite a bit, right? So I think there the question really is ultimately an economic one, but a holistic economic one, in that you have to know something about the impacts of the plastic in the place that it is, in the form that it currently is, in order to make a decision about whether or not it's worth it to make efforts to clean it up. And this giant boom that's out there in the Pacific right now, that's a great example of, I don't know if they made the effort to make a decision about how to spend, presumably that costs millions of dollars, right? So. To me, as a fisheries scientist, I look at that and I go, well, that requires a management strategy evaluation. Is that the best use of your money? And what was the axes of derived benefit that you're considering? Is it just to get stuff out of the water? Or are you trying to minimize entanglements? And if that's what you're trying to do, then you should go out and do habitat evaluations to try and figure out where the most likely places where entanglement items and whales are going to be, right? And that's, in fishery science, we do bycatch estimation spatially all the time. Anyway, I'm rambling, but the point is that the answer is totally it depends, and you have to decide what's important to you before you can make an assessment as to whether or not it's worth it or not.
Great. Carol, you want to add to that?
I did want to add to the beach, well, it's kind of a blend now. There was a study done on the cost of beach cleanups, like commercial, municipal beach cleanups across communities in California, and it was something like $500 million per year is spent cleaning beaches. So there clearly is an economic value associated with clean beaches in California, obviously because of tourism. So I think the answer to your question, at least on municipal scales, is yes, and I would also argue that personally, why not? Just pick up the trash.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Additional questions?
We
in
have
the
two questions
threads?
back here, and then you can go around.
Hi. First of all, I want to thank the panel for giving us a great set of illuminating and articulate presentations on a serious problem. So my question concerns incineration. So is that really a viable, clean means of disposing of plastic that doesn't generate a lot of toxic gases? And if it is it economically feasible? And if that's true, then why is it only 12%? So thank you.
So where I've seen incineration work is usually where it's cold. So Scandinavia has a lot of successful waste or combustion facilities that also recover energy. But what you also can recover in those, in a cogeneration standpoint, is heat. And that's really where it becomes a bit more efficient in terms of creating electricity and heat from the waste material. And managing, and when you do compost it that way, you also have ash, and it's not trivial to build an ash landfill and manage ash in a landfill. You do reduce your volume by 90%. So your question about the gases, there has to be proper air pollution controls, and depending upon the country and the public acceptance of whether or not it will actually be a properly regulated facility makes a huge difference. This is also where I talk a little bit about the culture and context. I mean, there's some places that just do not want to have an incineration facility. I think where we see the thermal treatment going is with pyrolysis and gasification. So pyrolysis, those can make liquid fuels from plastic. They also have challenges because you need to have a fairly homogeneous stream of plastic going in, and that's not typically sort of what we find in our regular day-to-day waste stream. And so there's challenges there, but that I see where that's going, because building the air pollution control unit is usually about this much and the facility itself is small, investing in that is a huge capital investment. And then you literally have to feed that facility to make the money when you're selling the electricity. Something smaller, batch scale like pyrolysis is probably going to be more feasible for thermal treatment if that is a route that people choose to take.
Any other comments from the panel? Okay. Next question.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your comments today. Very insightful. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the funding landscape for this type of research and where there's opportunities to increase the interdisciplinary nature of this research, especially having someone from waste management here is really great and illuminating, because I know sometimes that isn't incorporated in the ocean plastic conversation quite as much. So are there opportunities for increasing that type of research, and any plugs for funding?
How many hours do we have to talk about this? Who wants to tackle this one? Maybe this is a topic for drinks.
I mean, I can take a stab at it.
Yeah.
So first of all, I would say I think that there's a tremendous amount of research funding available outside of the United States. There are huge projects in Japan and China and the EU to study ocean plastics. In the US, we have the NOAA Marine Debris Program, which is a fabulous program with a really small budget, and they have quite a big set of responsibilities, including prevention and cleanup, as well as research and education. So that's challenging, especially as interest in the topic grows, which is a fabulous thing, and the number of papers published and the number of scientists wanting to do the work is growing, but it makes it extremely competitive to try to get those funds. So I think that we are in sort of a tight spot right now, and that's why it's imperative to have folks from the private foundations who are showing an interest in this work. And I'm not sure about other federal agencies. The Save Our Seas Act is elevating the topic. There was a hearing on ocean plastics last week in one of the US Senate committees. So I have hope that maybe there'll be more research funding, but right now it is sparse.
Yeah, I will say as a grad student here at Scripps, which has an amazing development office and relationships with private donors, it was very clear, like I was lucky that there's a lot of private interest and foundation interest in plastics. So it's always nice to work on something that the public knows what it is and cares about it. So it was easier than some of my friends.
I would kind of add to that, as an ocean-going scientist, the cost of going out to sea and collecting data that is really transformative and needed is really expensive. Our large-going ocean ships can incur tremendous costs, not to mention the cost of funding the science parties, the instruments that we use. And so I think coordinated efforts with larger sums of money can really transform our understanding of the problem. Mm-hmm. We had a question here in the front.
Hi there. Thank you very much for being here. And my question is, what is your opinion of the Ocean Cleanup Project?
Ooh. Guys want to rock, paper, scissors for that one?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess I can speak to that, coming from the country of origin. I think that the inspiration behind the idea is really admirable, and I think it really is important for the next generation to be owning the problem. I think we all need to own the problem. I think that some solutions are better suited for different environments, and at least based on the science that we know now, I think if the cleanup is really targeting larger pieces of plastic, then it might be more effective in more coastal areas where such volume of macroplastic is higher. But again, I think I applaud his passion for the problem, and really, we talked about funding, mobilizing a community of philanthropy and also government support towards the problem. And I think that that's something important, he's among other young people that are doing the same and trying to raise awareness of the problem. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think you saw the Mr. Trash wheel up there a couple of times, and that's actually relatively similar technology, but at a river, picking up large trash. So that's where the trash is still larger and not degraded, and you're funneling it. Using this large funnel system in an area where the trash is mainly micro debris, it's not the right solution for the right problem. And so I think if you had a maybe smaller scale ocean cleanup at certain river basins, it might be a lot more effective of a solution.
Let's take
Also,
one more opinion.
oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
go for it, Tracy.
You could imagine perhaps a hurricane coming through and hitting this instrument that's collecting this stuff. And it's made out of plastic, right? So
Yeah. The sea surface exposed to sunlight,
Yeah.
yes.
generating
Very
potential
biodegradable.
microplastics.
Just to be a little
One
bit
more.
upbeat about it. Not to, yeah. Again, there's kind of multiple axes of benefit, and one is pulling plastic out of the ocean, but the other is, you know what, they've done a really nice job of raising awareness. And whether or not you think the thing's going to work, I guarantee you, 10 out of 100 more people know about ocean plastics as a problem now because of that. And to me, that's the sort of the non-direct benefit to it that I think actually does something. And so, the old college try, even if it doesn't work, still benefits all of us.
Though I would counter that I have actually been at talks or given lectures about plastic, and I've had people say, why are you even still working on this? Hasn't Boy and Slack cleaned it up already? Or isn't this thing going to clean it up in 10 years? Like, aren't you guys done? And so I think it's great that so many more people do know about it, but if it's not going to work, then maybe the PR is slightly off.
It's a good plug for scientists to get out there and communicate their research and improve public understanding. There's a question by this man here in the front.
Can we go here first? She's been waiting a little
Okay,
bit.
sure.
Yeah, I'd like to know more about the research regarding the transfer of toxins from the marine plastics. I was pleased but surprised to hear that research hasn't shown that it transfers, because I know that's a big concern. But what additional research is going on that front, and what do we need to know to understand how it affects marine organisms and our food supply?
Great question. Anybody want to take a stab? Tracy?
Sure. Working with colleagues on a project that is, many of these studies use plastics at unrealistically high concentrations. And so using radioactive tracers, you can work at realistic, very low concentrations, a very sensitive method. And radioactively labeling PCBs, for example, and then sorbing them onto plastics and then feeding those to test animals. And so we're currently with this work group with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, in Monaco, conducting or planning to conduct some studies on this to be able to get at that question with much more realistic animals and concentrations. So it's on the way, underway.
I can also add to that. At least in the Netherlands, there's also there was a recent call that I was part of, along with other colleagues, in more the biomedical field, to look at microplastics in human health. And a big part of that is nanoplastics, and also using more realistic kinds of plastic in these experiments, where looking at human cell lines and how they interact with plastics. So sort of different levels, both uptake, but then also specific interactions with things like POPs. So that kind of science is happening, at least in Europe, that I'm aware of.
Kara, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think a large proportion of the tremendous upsurge in research is focused on this very question, the impacts of ingestion of microplastics and what transfers into the animals. And What's really important to remember is that obviously there's a huge diversity of animals. There's also a huge diversity of plastics and a huge diversity of chemicals. And so when you construct a lab experiment, you're often controlling so that you can test a single situation, a single outcome. And there have been laboratory studies that do show negative impacts that may be sublethal, but they can affect growth or reproduction. So it's not to say there's no evidence of harm, but what's hard is to say, taking that laboratory study, how can we then infer something about what's happening in nature? And so there's a huge gap there, and I'm not a biologist, so I can't exactly answer the part of the question of how are we ultimately going to get those answers, but we do need to start constructing experiments that are more representative of the exposures that we see in nature. And one of the big gaps there is we don't exactly know what's out in nature right now. So we know what we've measured, and what we've measured is a small piece. Like we tow plankton nets and we get particles of a certain size, and we're starting to characterize those in terms of the polymers that they are, but it's really hard, and in fact impossible in some cases, to look at particles that are much smaller than what you collect in a plankton net. So a lot of really just research gaps at this point, and that need to be filled before we can definitively say anything about, at a broad scale, what the level of harm is.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to that?
Again, just in my last couple of days of looking around the literature, I found many more studies that suggested impacts were minimal to completely negligible than vice versa, and some of the studies that showed the highest impacts were in worms and benthic organisms, where plastics would impact energy absorption in the digestive system, for instance. But in terms of looking at PCBs on microplastics in both lobsters and cod, both came back as sort of negligible in terms of transfer of PCBs through ingestion. So again, I'm not saying that it's not a thing, but I guess my feeling is we need to be, it may be down the road that we find some really terrible chemical interactions that are the result of plastics in the ocean that have disruptive properties in biological systems. But at this point, the evidence of that is really not all that clear. And I'd be careful, because what I did find out in poking around the literature, and especially sort of more of the gray literature and into the nonprofit world, is that there's a ton of information out there suggesting that is the major problem with plastics in the ocean. But if you get into the primary literature, gosh, there's not a lot of evidence that that's true. It's just not. So I think we got to be careful with that. It's not to say that there's tons to talk about with plastics that that we don't have to go down that road to continue to believe that plastics in the ocean is a real problem.
I have a question for the panel to follow that up. How many of you guys, since you've spent large parts of your career studying this topic, how many of you eat seafood?
Certain seafood.
There you go, the whole panel. Okay, another question from the audience.
Well, and can I just follow up on that too?
Sure.
Sorry, I keep talking. But that's a really important point too, right? Because in order to get the plastics that are moving through digestive systems, you have to be able to eat whole organisms, and when we're eating fish, oftentimes those things have been gutted, and so most of that plastic is removed before we even eat it. Now, it's a different story for mussels and bivalves and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I don't eat bivalves, actually. Partially for this reason, partially because they're like the air filters of the ocean. Like, what? Don't eat them. It's their whole job is to eat the toxins.
Can I comment in?
Sure.
I am much more concerned about the plastics I encounter in my everyday life rather than through my seafood. So plastics are everywhere. There was one study that looked at, it was some kind of invertebrate ingestion study, but they also, as a side thing, put a petri dish with sticky tape next to somebody's dinner plate, and just a standard household, and the amount of fibers and particles that fell out of the air during dinner was much higher than what was in their invertebrate, whatever, mussel, oyster, whatever it was. So that's part of I also just enjoy seafood.
There is, yeah. It is also like a Western perspective that we don't eat the fish stomachs. So there are places where they're eating the whole fish, and so if it's in there, they're consuming it. And there is a paper by Chelsea Rockman where she bought fish at the fish market, and that's what she was dissecting. So these fish are marketed for human consumption and had plastic in the stomach.
I have a question here in the front.
Hi, thank you very much for coming tonight, and I apologize for the brownie bites. Maybe that was my fault because we bought it at Costco. And how can we do to stop these supermarkets to put everything in plastic? It's overwhelming. I really try to eat less to avoid to consume less stuff like this, but it's just overwhelming. You go to Trader Joe's, everything is plastic. You buy things at Costco, and they bring the things around plastic, within the plastic, more plastic. It's just too much. You drive on the freeway, you see the plastic flying. You fly in Torrey Pines, you see plastic flying. It's just plastic. So how can we do to are we going to jump in the street with signs and say, please stop the plastic? What can we do as citizens of this world to help you guys with solutions and stop Costco for doing the brownie bites with plastic?
Suggestions from the panel about individual choices we can make in our everyday lives.
I can tell an anecdote. I feel your frustration. I do think that we're starting to see cultural shifts, especially with all these straw bans and skip the straw movements. We have a single-use reduction outreach program at SEA in Falmouth on Cape Cod, and as part of that, we were giving away stainless steel reusable straws. So we ordered 200 straws, and they came individually wrapped in plastic in a box filled with plastic. It was appalling. And so my summer intern took a photo of all the plastic, and she unwrapped every straw individually because we certainly weren't going to hand them out wrapped in plastic. And so she took a picture of this package of plastic, and I said, can you please weigh that? And so I emailed the company, and I said, listen, we're ordering these straws, and they were back ordered because so many people are ordering stainless steel straws. I said, listen, I'm guessing the people ordering these are trying to reduce their plastic footprint. The amount of plastic these came packaged in is equivalent to more than 400 single-use plastic straws. Can we please do something about this? And at first, oh no, it's our supplier. And then a week later, I got an email that said, we talked to our supplier, they're now using a compostable plastic, and I got a call from the president of the company, who I have yet to return the call. But my point is, say something. I mean, make the point. And we're all consumers. People want to make money. They want to keep selling. And the name of this company, I'm not going to fully reveal, but it has eco in the name. So it was even worse. I felt greenwashed. But I think we just have to say something. We have to choose. There's bulk stores that are popping up. And if we all show up at Whole Foods with our glass jar for the deli counter or whatever, I mean, things will change. I have hope.
Can I just say one more thing to that response or the question? And that is that I think the packaging industry is starting to hear the consumer. And as consumers, the best thing we can do is complain and to speak up. And also, I mean, as scientists, to participate in venues where we can interface directly with those decision makers. And also our politicians, you know. We as citizens can make a difference. And I think, you know, look at the straw, look at the microbead. I mean, really, the microbead ban is, I mean, that has to be a historic decision that was taken. And again, it's public perception, public pressure, and it does make a difference at times. And I think those are good examples.
And as far as being overwhelmed, take like one thing to tackle, because I'm with you on, if you tried to do all of like your personal choices and then it, you know, like just even one thing does matter. So, you know, just pick one thing to tackle and then you can kind of, you know, get the ball rolling.
Great.
Well, not to complicate things, but also there's new technical plastics that are sandwiched, like 3 different plastics all in one layer to package steaks and things like this. And it's great benefits because the steak lasts much longer on the shelf, and it's very light, but it's also not recyclable. And even industry doesn't know how it could possibly be recycled. But they're creating these things because they have these benefits.
Absolutely. So we have drinks and refreshments that I believe are not wrapped in plastics waiting for us. So we're going to take one or two more questions from the audience. There's a couple in the back here.
Hi, thank you. My question is around what has been the most effective way to communicate plastics to your friends and relatives, and how many Americans are recycling right now? Do you guys have a better number than I may? Just curious.
Better number than what?
I read 40%, but I think that's high.
Yeah, our recycle rate, our overall recycle rate in the U.S. is like 32, maybe 33, somewhere around there. Maybe as high as 35. That is a U.S. average. Certainly differs by every state, and then that's all materials. So plastic is really still about the same as the entire global average, about 9%. And this is by mass, so we know the plastic doesn't weigh very much for as much volume it takes up, but our recycle rate's about 9%. And for my family and friends, they often get reusable things in their Christmas stockings. I've given straws, I've given utensils, I've given stainless steel cups. I mean, that's just my direct family, yeah.
I think for communication, everyone knows they use plastic. Like, everyone sees the plastic in their lives, and so it's not that hard to connect the dots that the trash in the environment is theirs. I think for some things like climate change, some people don't want to believe that that's a man-made issue, but no one thinks plastic like naturally occurs in the ocean. So it's not as hard to communicate necessarily that like this is a human caused problem, and it's more the next step of like, will my individual tiny changes make a difference? And that's where I think it is things like the microbead ban or the straw ban of like a few people getting mad about something can cause big changes, or a few people organizing to make these big beach cleanups can actually clean up like thousands of pounds of trash. So that's where you can really bring action about.
Any other tips on how to communicate with your friends and family from the panel? Tracy, looks like you want to say
Sure.
something.
I used to live in Falmouth, Massachusetts, and our tiny town took a big step, I think, in banning plastic bags. But there was all kinds of testimony. At the time, I was an elected official there, and we were deciding on this. And one person stood up and said, "There is no peer-reviewed literature about plastics in the ocean." And like, whoa, wait a minute, there's hundreds every month. And others came up. There was a letter from a local grocery store that said, if we stop using plastic bags, it will be economic hardship for our business. And like, no, it won't. It's just like there was a lot of emotion. There was. But in the end, we decided to ban it because our coastal community and stopping plastic bags is a good thing. But there's a lot of misinformation out there, I think.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of questions, hands still up, but I think all of us are going to be around at the reception. So as I said, look for the folks with name tags if you have burning questions that you want to ask. And let's please thank our panel for their time and insight. And I'll just call Stuart up to close us out.
So I want to, thank you guys. We are here at the Plastics Awareness Global Initiative, and I figured that just to make sure that we give one quick anecdote of that global impact that I think reaches something that's recent to the time that Igor, Steve, Stu, and I spent recently in Micronesia. We were visiting the island of Pohnpei, and the traditional leader, Willie Hali, the governor of the island of Pohnpei State,
They were asking us questions, and they asked us questions specifically about plastics. One of the little offshore islands there, Ant Atoll, the beaches getting covered in plastics, and they asked us, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to solve this problem? And we mused at it and thought about it, and I think there were a lot of good discussions. But two things really came to point there and came to bear that I think are topical here. The first is there was a big interest from Rosa and from the governor to know where was it coming from? What's the scope and scale of the problem? That's the science. That's the science of what we'll be doing here, is trying to quantify that so we can deliver that message. The second is, what can we do? How can you motivate change? They were looking into ways to put a tax on plastic bottles, et cetera, in-house. And these are actions taken by a nation that does not have much disposable income, looking to make some positive change. And we were really fascinated by this positive, productive view. But that's the economic side. That's the strategy, and that's what we'll be thinking about tomorrow and for the extension of the PAGI initiative. So I do want us to be thinking creatively about the science of what we know and then what we can do tomorrow. I think that we're only going to do this all together. So I do want to take us here to the reception, but before we do that, I want to make sure that we thank the panelists again. Thank you very much. And Igor, thank you for opening up the ceremony, and thank you to the Wilsdorf Mettler Future Foundation for the support here and the other interested donors. This is really something, as we pointed out earlier, is not coming through federal or state investment. It's coming through the CARE support and really the social investment, us solving our own problem. We're at 7.5 billion people on the planet. Well, in that are 7.5 billion problems and 7.5 billion solutions. So let's make sure that we use each one of those. Let's try to minimize the problems, maximize the solutions, and enjoy a refreshment. So thanks very much.